Dust cascaded off the old man's boots, staining the immaculate showroom floor. Nobody in the high-end tactical shop knew his name, but they all judged his faded flannel and soil-caked jeans. Young clerks snickered behind glass counters, polishing custom firearms meant for men with deep pockets, not deep wrinkles. They mocked his quiet voice. They pointed at his calloused hands. They thought he was just a confused, penniless farmer lost in the wrong store. But the moment the shop's owner, a hardened, decorated combat veteran, stepped out of his office, the laughter died. Because the owner didn't just recognize the old man. He froze, his face draining of color, before snapping a crisp salute, tears welling in his eyes. Hawthorne's elite armory was not the kind of place you walked into by accident. Nestled in the affluent, meticulously manicured suburbs of Oak Brook, Illinois, the storefront looked more like a luxury car dealership than a gun shop. The exterior featured sleek, tinted glass and matte black steel accents. Inside, the floors were poured epoxy, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the cool, recessed LED lighting overhead. There were no dusty racks of hand-me-down hunting rifles here. The glass display cases housed hardware that cost more than some people's vehicles. Custom machined staccato 2011s, suppressed Knight's armament rifles, and bespoke Nighthawk custom 1911s that fetched upwards of $6,000 apiece. The clientele matched the inventory. On any given Tuesday, the shop was filled with private security contractors picking up premium gear, wealthy tech executives indulging in high-end weekend hobbies, and tactical enthusiasts clad in pristine, never-dirtied 5.11 cargo pants. Behind the main counter stood Logan and Chad. Both were in their late 20s, sporting impeccably groomed facial hair, tight black polo shirts bearing the store's logo, and an air of unearned superiority. They were tactical bros in the truest sense, capable of reciting the ballistic coefficient of a 6.5 Creedmoor round from memory, but completely devoid of any real-world combat experience. They spent their days fawning over VIP customers and quietly judging anyone who didn't fit their narrow demographic of what a serious shooter should look like. At precisely 10:15 a.m., the heavy glass door chimed. The man who walked in was a jarring anomaly in the chrome and glass environment. Abram Moreau looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent the last 40 years coaxing crops out of stubborn, unyielding earth. He was 75 years old, though the deep crevices around his eyes and the weathered, leather-like texture of his skin made him look older. He wore a faded, tan Carhartt jacket with frayed cuffs, a pair of denim overalls that had seen better decades, and heavy work boots caked in dried mud and pulverized soybean dust. A battered John Deere baseball cap sat atop his head, shading eyes that were a piercing, pale blue. As he stepped onto the polished epoxy floor, a small clump of dried mud dislodged from the heel of his boot, leaving a visible brown smudge against the pristine white aisle. From behind the counter, Logan nudged Chad, nodding toward the entrance. Chad let out a low, derisive snort. "Looks like somebody took a wrong turn at the feed store," Chad muttered, not bothering to lower his voice nearly enough. "I'll give him 3 minutes before he asks where we keep the Daisy BB guns or complains that everything costs more than $100, Logan replied, leaning casually against the glass display case, wiping down a $4,000 Wilson combat pistol with a microfiber cloth. Abram ignored them. Or, more accurately, he simply didn't care. He walked with a slow, deliberate, almost mechanical gait. His left knee popped audibly with every other step, a souvenir from a lifetime ago, long before he ever sat on a tractor. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets, his pale blue eyes sweeping over the store. He wasn't overwhelmed by the sleek, modern weaponry. He didn't gawk at the thermal optics or the suppressed short-barreled rifles hanging on the back wall. His gaze was methodical, scanning the room, assessing the layout, noting the exits. It was a habit he had never managed to break, ingrained into his very nervous system. He slowly made his way to the center island, a circular display case reserved for the store's most exclusive, rare, and historically significant pieces. Hawthorne's elite armory was known for occasionally sourcing museum-grade firearms. Abram stopped, his eyes locked onto a specific pistol resting on a velvet stand under a solitary, bright halogen spotlight. It was a Colt M1911A1. But it wasn't just any 1000. 911. The bluing was worn along the edges of the slide, speaking to years of being carried in a leather holster. The walnut grips were smooth, the checkering flattened by the sweat and friction of a human hand. Next to it was a small placard that read, "Authentic Vietnam, Era Bring Back. Authenticated U.S. Army issue, 1,968. Not for sale. Display only." Abram stared at the pistol. The ambient noise of the shop, the hum of the air conditioner, the faint playing of classic rock over the speakers, the murmurs of other customers seemed to fade away. For a fleeting moment, the sterile smell of the gun shop was replaced by the phantom stench of damp jungle rot, burning diesel, and cordite. He slowly raised his right hand, pressing his calloused, scarred fingertips against the cool glass. "Hey, buddy." The sharp, nasal voice shattered the silence. Abram blinked, the memory dissolving back into the harsh LED lighting of the store. He turned his head. Logan was staring at him from across the aisle, a scowl twisting his features. "Can I help you find something? Or are you just here to smudge up my glass?" Abram pulled his hand back, wiping the slight fingerprint off the glass with the sleeve of his jacket. "Just looking, son," he said. His voice was gravelly, quiet, carrying the slow, deliberate cadence of the rural Midwest. "It's a fine piece you have here." "Yeah, well, it's not for sale," Logan said, walking out from behind the counter and approaching Abram. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture unnecessarily aggressive, attempting to loom over the older man. "And even if it was, I guarantee it's a bit out of your price range. The farm supply store is about 3 miles down the interstate if you're looking for varmint traps." Abram didn't flinch. He didn't puff out his chest or raise his voice. He simply looked at Logan. The pale blue eyes were entirely devoid of intimidation, fear, or even annoyance. They were completely, unsettlingly calm. "I'm aware of where the farm store is," Abram replied evenly. "I came here. I'm looking for a gift. For my grandson." Chad, having ambled over to join his coworker, laughed out loud. "A gift? Grandpa, the cheapest thing in this case is a heavily modified Glock that runs about 1,500. We don't sell hunting shotguns here. This is a tactical armory." "I know what this is," Abram said softly, his eyes shifting back to the vintage 1,911. "I just want to look at the inventory. If you don't mind." Before Logan could issue another condescending remark, the front door chimed again. Both clerks immediately abandoned Abram, their demeanors shifting from hostile to subservient as a new customer walked in. The new arrival was Brent. Brent was a familiar face at Hawthorne's, a wealthy commercial real estate developer who treated the gun store like a country club. He was wearing a tailored Italian sport coat over a designer t-shirt, a Rolex Submariner gleaming on his wrist. Brent bought expensive guns the way other men bought golf clubs, rarely to use them, mostly to show them off to his friends in his climate-controlled walk-in vault. "Brent, good to see you, man," Logan beamed, extending a hand. "Hey, boys," Brent said, his voice booming and full of unearned confidence. He shook Logan's hand, deliberately ignoring Abram, who had stepped back to give them space. "Tell me you got that new SIG spear in, the one we talked about." "Just arrived yesterday," Chad chimed in eagerly. "Held it in the back just for you. Want me to go grab it?" "You know it," Brent said, leaning against the counter. As Chad hurried off to the back stockroom, Brent finally turned his head, his eyes landing on Abram. He took in the muddy boots, the frayed jacket, and the distinct smell of livestock and old machinery that clung to the farmer. Brent's nose wrinkled in visible disgust. "Rough year for the corn harvest, huh?" Brent quipped, looking at Logan for a shared laugh. Logan obliged immediately, chuckling. Abram kept his hands in his pockets. "Corn's doing just fine," he said quietly. "Soybeans could use some rain, though." Brent smirked. "Well, unless you're planning on trading a few bushels of soybeans for a firearm, you might be in the wrong zip code, old-timer. This stuff isn't exactly cheap." He tapped his platinum credit card against the glass counter. "Takes real capital to play with the big boys." Abram looked at Brent, really looked at him. He saw the soft hands, the perfect manicure, the eyes that had never seen a moment of genuine terror or hardship in their entire existence. Abram had known men like Brent. Usually, they were the officers who flew in by helicopter after a firefight was over, wearing clean uniforms to inspect the damage and take credit for the blood spilled by better men. "I have money," Abram said simply. He turned his attention back to Logan. "I'd like to see the Nighthawk custom on the back wall. The commander size, chambered in, 45. Logan sighed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Look, man, I'm busy with a preferred client right now. And frankly, I don't have the time to pull down a $4,000 custom 1,911 just so you can take a picture of it and tell your buddies at the diner." "I didn't ask to take a picture," Abram said, his voice dropping half an octave, the quiet rural drawl suddenly carrying a razor-sharp edge. "I asked to see the weapon." The shift in Abram's tone was subtle, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of Logan's neck stand up. For a split second, the clerk felt a primal, instinctual flare of warning, but Logan's ego quickly overrode his instincts. He scoffed, stepping closer to Abram. "And I said no," Logan sneered. "Now, why don't you do us all a favor and hit the road before you track any more cow crap onto my floor? You're stinking up the showroom." Brent laughed heartily, clearly enjoying the show. "Yeah, Pops, go buy yourself a new tractor. Leave the high-end hardware to the professionals." Abram didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a rock in the middle of a rushing stream. He looked down at the mud smudge on the floor, then back up at Logan. "I'd like to speak to the owner," Abram said. "The owner is busy," Logan snapped, his face flushing with anger. He hated being challenged, especially in front of a big spender like Brent. "He doesn't have time to deal with window shoppers. I'm the manager on duty, and I'm telling you to leave. Now, before I have you trespassed." Chad emerged from the back room, carrying a heavy, black, hard case. He sensed the tension immediately, dropping the case on the counter and puffing out his chest. "We got a problem out here?" "Just a squatter who doesn't know when to leave," Logan said, glaring at Abram. "I'm not leaving until I speak to the owner," Abram repeated. The absolute lack of fear in his voice was infuriating to the two young clerks. They were used to people bowing to their artificial authority inside these four walls. "Right, that's it," Chad said, stepping out from behind the counter. He walked right up to Abram, invading his personal space, trying to use his height and weight to intimidate the old man. Chad reached out, grabbing Abram roughly by the shoulder of his Carhartt jacket. "Time to go, Grandpa." The moment Chad's hand touched the fabric, the world seemed to violently fast forward. Abram didn't strike the boy. He didn't throw a punch. In a movement so fluid and fast that neither Brent nor Logan could fully process it, Abram's left hand shot out, clamping around Chad's wrist. With a slight pivot of his hips and a precise, brutal application of leverage, Abram twisted the wrist inward. Chad let out a yelp of sudden, blinding pain, his knees buckling as he was forced to bend sideways to keep his arm from snapping. Abram didn't exert maximum force. He merely applied exactly enough pressure to completely neutralize the threat, holding Chad frozen in a painful, awkward contortion. "Don't ever put your hands on me, son," Abram whispered, his face inches from Chad's ear. His voice was no longer that of a weary farmer. It was cold, flat, and carried the undeniable weight of a man who had ended lives in the dark. "Hey, let him go," Logan shouted, his hand instinctively dropping toward the open-carried Glock 19 on his hip. He didn't draw it, but his hand rested on the grip, his heart pounding against his ribs. Brent stumbled backward, knocking over a display stand of cleaning supplies. His bravado entirely vanished. "Whoa, hey, call the cops. The crazy old man is attacking him." Abram released Chad's wrist, giving him a slight shove backward. Chad stumbled and fell onto his backside, clutching his arm, his eyes wide with genuine shock and a sudden, newfound terror. "I said," Abram repeated, his pale eyes locking onto Logan's hand, which was trembling on the grip of his pistol. "I want to speak to the owner." The shouting, the clatter of the falling display stand, and Chad's cry of pain had echoed loudly through the high ceilings of the showroom. From the heavy oak door at the rear of the shop, a voice boomed out, cutting through the chaos like a gunshot. "What in the hell is going on out here?" The heavy oak door slammed against the wall. Out stepped Damian Hawthorne. If the young clerks were playing dress-up, Damian Hawthorne was the terrifying reality. At 55, Damian was built like a cinder block. He had close-cropped, salt and pepper hair, a thick, neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wasn't wearing a branded polo. He wore a simple black t-shirt that stretched over thick, scarred arms and faded denim jeans. Damien Hawthorne was a legend in the local community, and not just because he owned a successful business. He was a former United States Army Ranger. Specifically, he had spent over a decade in the 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. He had deployed multiple times, seen the absolute worst of human nature, and carried the physical and mental scars to prove it. He ran his shop with military precision, and he demanded absolute professionalism from his staff. He stormed down the aisle, his heavy boots thudding against the epoxy floor. The fury radiating from him was palpable. He hated disturbances in his shop. He hated unprofessionalism even more. "Logan," Damien barked, his voice commanding instant silence. "Take your hand off your sidearm before I break your fingers. What is the meaning of this?" Logan immediately snapped his hand away from his hip, looking like a child caught stealing candy. He pointed a trembling finger at Abram, whose back was currently facing Damien. "Dave, I swear to God, this guy is crazy," Logan stammered, his voice cracking. "He came in here tracking mud everywhere, harassing Brent, demanding to see guns he can't afford. When we asked him to leave, he assaulted Chad. Look at him. He practically broke his arm." Chad was scrambling to his feet, cradling his wrist, nodding furiously. "He attacked me, boss, totally unprovoked. We need to call the police right now." Brent, sensing the arrival of authority, stepped forward, dusting off his designer jacket. "It's true, Damien. Your boys were just doing their jobs. This vagrant comes in, starts making demands, smelling like a damn barn. You need to have him trespassed. He's a menace." Damien's jaw tightened. He looked at Chad, assessing the injury. No broken bones, just a bruised ego and a sprained wrist. Then he looked at the mud on the floor. Finally, his eyes shifted to the old man in the faded Carhartt jacket, who was standing quietly near the center display case, his back still turned to the office. Damien took a deep breath, preparing to do what he hated doing, throwing someone out of his store. He took 2 large steps forward, closing the distance between himself and the farmer. "Sir," Damien began, his voice hard, authoritative, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I don't care what was said. You do not put your hands on my employees. You need to leave this establishment immediately, or I will have local law enforcement escort you out. Turn around and walk out that door." The store went dead silent. Logan and Chad exchanged smug, triumphant looks. Brent crossed his arms, waiting for the pathetic old man to shuffle out in disgrace. Slowly, deliberately, Abram turned around. He didn't look angry. He didn't look intimidated by the massive, imposing figure of the former Army Ranger standing just feet away from him. He simply turned, lifting his gaze from the floor to meet Damien's angry stare. "Hello, Davy," Abram said softly. Damien Hawthorne stopped. He didn't just stop walking. His entire body seemed to shut down. The furious, commanding presence vanished instantly. The color rapidly drained from Damien's face, leaving him looking as pale as a sheet. His jaw slacked. The clipboard he had been holding in his left hand slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly onto the polished epoxy floor, scattering inventory papers everywhere. "Boss?" Logan asked tentatively, the smugness evaporating from his face. "You okay?" Damien didn't hear him. The pristine gun shop, the obnoxious customer, the whining clerks, all of it dissolved. Suddenly, Damien wasn't standing in Oak Brook, Illinois, in 2026. He was 22 years old again. It was October 1993. The air was suffocatingly hot, thick with the stench of burning tires, raw sewage, and copper. He was pinned down behind the crumbling walls of a rusted-out vehicle in the labyrinthine streets of Mogadishu, Somalia. The air was thick with a blizzard of incoming AK-47 fire and RPG explosions. His ears were ringing, blood was pouring from shrapnel wounds in his thigh, and he was absolutely certain he was going to die in the dirt, thousands of miles from home. And then, stepping through the smoke and the chaos, completely unbothered by the hellfire raining down around them, was a man in an incredibly dusty black Pro-Tech helmet, a Delta Force operator. The man had grabbed Damien by the webbing of his gear, hauling him over his shoulder like a sack of grain. and carried him 3 blocks through a gauntlet of enemy fire to safety, firing his car. 1-5 with one hand the entire way. That Delta operator had been a legend, a quiet, terrifyingly calm ghost of a man who commanded the absolute reverence of every ranger in the chalk. Sergeant Major Abraham Moreau. Damien's breath hitched in his throat. He stared at the old, weathered face, the deep wrinkles, the faded Carhartt jacket. But the eyes, those piercing, pale blue, unflinching eyes, were exactly the same. "My God," Damien whispered, his voice trembling in a way that Logan and Chad had never, ever heard before. Damien's posture completely shifted. The aggressive, forward-leaning stance vanished. Instinctively, muscle memory taking over from decades of ingrained respect, Damien straightened his spine. He brought his feet together. His right hand snapped up in a razor-sharp, textbook military salute, his fingers trembling ever so slightly against his temple. "Sergeant Major Moreau," Damien choked out, tears suddenly welling in his hardened eyes, threatening to spill over. It is an absolute honor to see you, sir." The silence that followed was deafening. Logan's jaw dropped so far it practically hit the floor. Chad stood frozen, completely forgetting about his sore wrist, his eyes darting back and forth between his terrifying boss and the muddy old farmer. Brent stood completely paralyzed, his arrogant smirk entirely wiped from his face. The man they had called a bum, a vagrant, a crazy old farmer, had just made a highly decorated, terrifying former combat ranger snap to attention and cry. Abram offered a faint, warm smile, returning a casual, 2-finger salute. "At ease, Davy," Abram rasped quietly. "You're making a scene in your own shop." Damien lowered his trembling hand, the crisp salute falling back to his side. He didn't bother to wipe the moisture from his eyes. In the hyper-masculine, ego-driven world of tactical retail, displaying emotion was often viewed as a weakness. But Damien Hawthorne didn't care. The man standing before him wasn't just a customer. He was a living phantom, a titan of modern warfare who had descended into the literal hell of the Baccara market and dragged Damien out by the shoulder straps of his tactical vest. The silence in the showroom was suffocating. The faint classic rock music playing from the overhead speakers suddenly felt absurdly loud. Logan swallowed hard, the sound audible in the tense quiet. "Boss, Dave, we didn't." Damien turned his head. The reverence and vulnerability that had just softened his hardened features vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a cold, radiating fury that made the ambient temperature of the room feel as though it had dropped 10 degrees. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously low, a slow, methodical grind of gravel and steel. "You didn't what, Logan?" Damien asked, taking a slow step toward the counter. "You didn't realize that the man you were mocking, the man you were trying to throw out into the street like a stray dog, is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. You didn't realize that you were speaking to a Tier 1 operator who has spilled more blood defending this nation than you could possibly comprehend in your pathetic Call of Duty fantasy world." Logan stepped back, his back hitting the rear display wall. All the color had drained from his impeccably groomed face. He looked. He was covered in mud, Dave. He didn't look like what? Damien interrupted, his voice finally rising, cracking like a bullwhip. Like a serious shooter? Like a guy who drops $5,000 on a rifle just to take pictures of it for Instagram? He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Chad, who was still clutching his sprained wrist, his eyes wide with unfiltered terror. "And you put your hands on him. You are incredibly, astronomically lucky that Sergeant Major Moreau is a merciful man. In his prime, if you had touched him like that, you wouldn't have walked away with a sore wrist. You would be leaving this building in a body bag. Do you understand me?" Chad nodded frantically, unable to form words. He had felt the crushing, mechanical power in the old man's grip. It wasn't the strength of someone trying to hurt him. It was the restrained, terrifying power of a man who knew exactly how to shatter bones but actively chose not to. Brent, the wealthy real estate developer, shifted uncomfortably. His designer Italian shoes squeaked against the epoxy floor. He cleared his throat, attempting to salvage his bruised ego and reassert his dominance. "Now, let's just hold on a minute, Damien," Brent said, pasting on a forced, condescending smile. "I respect the military as much as anyone, truly. Thank you for your service, sir. But let's be rational. Your boys were just protecting the store. He was stinking up the place. And frankly, he was making me uncomfortable. As one of your top-tier clients, I think Damien snapped his head toward Brent, cutting him off so sharply the developer physically flinched. Brent, Damien said, his tone devoid of any of the usual customer service warmth he forced himself to use. You come in here twice a month. You buy high-end European hardware. You complain about the wait times for tax stamps. And you brag about guns you don't even know how to properly clean. You think spending money makes you a warrior. It doesn't. Damien walked over to the counter, reached over the glass, and snatched the platinum credit card Brent had been tapping earlier. He held it up, then tossed it back, letting it clatter against Brent's chest before falling to the floor. Pick up your plastic, Brent. Your VIP status is revoked, Damien stated flatly. I don't want your money today. I don't want it tomorrow. If you ever disrespect a man like this in my presence again, I will personally throw you through that tinted front window. Get out of my shop. Brent stared in shock, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He looked to Logan and Chad for support, but the two clerks were staring fixedly at the floor, absolutely terrified of drawing Damien's attention back to themselves. Realizing he was entirely stripped of his power, Brent hastily bent down, snatched his credit card, and speed walked toward the front entrance, the heavy glass door hissing shut behind him. Damien turned back to his two employees. You two, take off your sidearms, clear them, lock them in the safe. Then you are going to get down on your hands and knees with a bucket of soapy water, and you are going to scrub this entire showroom floor until you can see your pathetic reflections in it. When you're done, you're both suspended for 2 weeks. Without pay. Dave, please, Logan begged, his voice cracking. Move, Damien roared, the command echoing with the terrifying authority of a Ranger squad leader under fire. Logan and Chad scrambled to comply, practically tripping over each other to unholster their weapons and retreat to the back room. The chaos settled. The showroom was quiet again. Damien closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting out a long, shaky breath, trying to corral the adrenaline that was flooding his nervous system. When he opened them, he turned back to Abram. The old farmer hadn't moved. His hands were still tucked calmly into the pockets of his faded Carhartt jacket. A faint, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his weathered lips. You always did have a temper on you, Davy, Abram said softly. Damien let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He walked over to the older man, reaching out his hand. Abram took it, and Damien immediately pulled him into a fierce, crushing embrace. For a moment, Abram stiffened, unaccustomed to such physical displays of emotion, before he brought his calloused hand up, patting Damien firmly on the broad back. I'm sorry, Major, Damien whispered into the rough canvas of Abram's coat. I am so damn sorry about them. Boys will be boys, Abram replied, stepping back. They don't know the weight of the steel they sell, Davy. You can't fault them for living in a peaceful world. We did what we did so they could be soft. Damien wiped his face, nodding slowly. Come on back to my office, sir. I'll pour us a coffee, or a bourbon if you prefer. Abram's eyes twinkled slightly. A coffee will do just fine, black. Assuming your fancy shop here knows how to brew it. The heavy oak door clicked shut, severing them from the sterile, brightly lit world of the showroom. Damien's private office was a stark contrast to the modern retail space out front. It was dimly lit by a heavy brass desk lamp, the walls paneled in dark, rich mahogany. The air smelled of old paper, Hoppy's No. 9 gun solvent, and leather. But it was the walls that told the true story. They were a shrine to a past life. Framed maps of the Middle East and the Horn of Africa hung alongside heavily redacted unit citations. Behind Damien's massive oak desk was a large glass shadow box. Inside rested a tattered, faded American flag, folded into a crisp triangle, sitting above a silver star and a purple heart. Next to the medals was a cracked, blood-stained compass, the very compass Damien had been holding when the RPG hit his convoy in Mogadishu. Abram took it all in. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, his muddy boots leaving faint tracks on the dark Persian rug. He stopped in front of a framed photograph. It was a picture of a younger Damien, his face smeared with camouflage paint, standing next to 5 other men in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. "Sergeant Evers," Abram murmured, pointing a scarred finger at one of the men in the photo. "He was a good kid, fast on the M60. He was," Damien said softly, moving to a small kitchenette in the corner to pour the coffee. "Lost him in Fallujah. 7 years after the picture was taken." Abram nodded slowly, the weight of the words settling over him. He knew the burden of outliving the men beside you. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that never truly came off. He moved to a large, worn leather armchair opposite Damien's desk and lowered himself into it. His left knee let out another loud, sharp pop, causing him to wince slightly. Damien handed him a steaming black ceramic mug, taking a seat behind his desk. He leaned back, just looking at the man across from him. It had been over 30 years. Abram's hair, once dark and cropped tight, was now a shocking, thin white. His face was a map of deep ravines and sun-damaged skin. "You completely fell off the grid, Major," Damien said, taking a sip of his coffee. "After you retired in '98, a bunch of the boys tried to track you down. We wanted to throw you a dinner, get you drunk, say thank you properly. But command said your file was sealed tight. No forwarding address. Nothing." Abram stared into the dark liquid in his mug. "I didn't want a dinner, Davy. I didn't want to talk about it anymore. You reach a point where the noise in your head is so loud, you have to go find the quietest place on earth just to balance it out." He looked up, his pale eyes meeting Damien's. "I bought 200 acres of dirt in Iowa, started growing corn and soybeans. When you spend your whole life taking things out of the ground, planting bodies in the dirt, there's a certain peace in putting seeds in the earth and watching them grow instead." Damien swallowed hard, the profound truth in the old soldier's words hitting him like a physical blow. He gestured around his office. "I took a different route. I couldn't leave the guns behind. I couldn't let go of the gear. So, I monetized it, built a fortress. I surround myself with weapons because it's the only way I can sleep through the night without feeling like the door is going to get kicked in." "There is no shame in survival, son," Abram said gently. "You built a good life here. I'm proud of you." The validation from his hero nearly broke Damien again. He had to clear his throat and look away for a moment, blinking rapidly to keep the tears at bay. "So," Damien said, changing the subject to regain his composure, "what brings a soybean farmer all the way to a high-end tactical shop in Oak Brook? You didn't drive 4 hours just to look at a museum piece." Abram set his mug down on the edge of the desk. The quiet, relaxed demeanor shifted, replaced by a sudden, intense gravity. The farmer vanished, and the Delta operator returned. "I'm here for my grandson," Abram said. "Jackson." "Jackson," Damien repeated, leaning forward. "Is he military?" "He's 22, Abram said, a mixture of fierce pride and deep sorrow in his voice. "He grew up listening to the stories I refused to tell. He found my old uniforms in the attic when he was 12. I tried to push him toward the farm, toward college. But it's in the blood, Davy. You know how it is." "I do." "He enlisted right out of high school," Abram continued, "breezed through basic, crushed airborne. He just got his tan beret last month. He's a ranger." A massive, genuine smile broke across Damien's face. "No kidding. A ranger, following in your footsteps. Following in yours, too," Abram pointed out. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. "He deploys in 3 weeks. Syria. The sandbox is heating up again, and they're sending his battalion into the thick of it." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Damien understood the dread of a loved one heading into the meat grinder. "He's a good boy," Abram said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's sharp, he's fast, and he's brave. But bravery doesn't stop bullets. I want to give him something before he leaves. A sidearm, something he can trust when the rifle jams and the world is burning down around him." Abram gestured vaguely toward the heavy oak door. "Those toys out there in your glass cases. They're pretty. They're built for competitions and showing off to country club friends. I don't want pretty. I need something that runs when the mud is thick, the sand is blowing, and the blood makes the grip slick. I need the best piece of steel you have." Abram reached into the inner pocket of his Carhartt jacket and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. He tossed it onto Damien's desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "There's $8,000 in cash in there," Abram said. Sell me the gun that brings my grandson home. Damien stared at the envelope. He didn't touch it. Instead, he slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He walked around the desk, picked up the envelope, and gently pressed it back into Abram's hands. Major, Damien said quietly, your money is no good here. It never will be. I pay my way, Davy, Abram insisted, his brow furrowing. I don't take charity. It's not charity, Damien replied, his voice firm. It's a debt I have owed you for 33 years. You saved my life. You gave me the chance to come home, to start a business, to breathe free air. Providing a weapon to keep your bloodline safe is the absolute least I can do. Abram opened his mouth to argue, but Damien held up a hand. Besides, Damien said, a faint, mysterious smile touching his lips. I don't have what you're looking for out there in the showroom. The gun Jackson needs. It's not behind glass. Damien walked past his desk to the far corner of the office, where a massive, floor-to-ceiling Mosler bank vault was built directly into the reinforced wall. He spun the heavy steel dial, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the quiet room. He pulled the heavy lever, and the massive door swung open with a smooth, silent glide that betrayed its immense weight. Abram watched intently from his chair. Damien stepped into the vault. When he emerged a moment later, he wasn't carrying a shiny, branded cardboard box or a velvet display stand. He was carrying a rugged, battle-scarred Pelican hard case. It looked heavy. He set it down on the center of his mahogany desk, directly in front of Abram. When I opened this shop 15 years ago, Damien began, his voice taking on a reverent tone, I started building custom firearms, not just assembling parts, but milling them from raw billet steel, hand-fitting every sear, every spring, every barrel lockup. I got really good at it. But 5 years ago, I decided I wanted to build a masterpiece, not a competition gun, a pure, unadulterated combat weapon. Damien popped the heavy plastic latches on the case. I built it with one specific philosophy in mind, Damien continued. I thought about the man who pulled me out of the fire in Mogadishu. I thought about what kind of weapon a ghost would carry into the dark. I spent a year sourcing the hardest tool steel, hand-lapping the slide until it moved like glass on ice. I never put it in the system. I never put a price tag on it. I just locked it in the vault. I didn't know who I was saving it for. Damien opened the lid. Abram leaned forward. Inside the foam cutout rested a pistol. It was a modern 2011 style platform, chambered in 9mm to allow for a higher capacity, but it retained the classic, perfect grip angle of the legendary 1911. It was stunning in its absolute lack of flash. There was no shiny chrome, no gaudy gold titanium nitride coating. It was finished in a deeply matte, non-reflective black nitride coating. The grips were aggressively textured, designed to bite into the hand and refuse to slip, even if coated in oil or blood. The sights were tall, solid steel tritium night sights. The frame featured an underbarrel rail for a weapon light. It wasn't a showpiece. It was an apex predator cast in steel. Abram reached into the case. As his calloused fingers wrapped around the grip, his eyes widened slightly. The weapon felt like a natural extension of his arm. It was perfectly balanced, heavy enough to mitigate recoil, but light enough to transition quickly between targets. He brought the gun up, keeping the muzzle pointed at the floor, and racked the slide back. The sound it made wasn't a clatter of loose metal. It was a singular, perfectly resonant snick-clack, the sound of microscopic tolerances locking together with absolute precision. It sounded like the closing of a bank vault door. I call it the Ghost, Damien whispered. The serial number on the frame is MOG 100393, the date you saved my life. Abram stared at the serial number engraved discreetly above the trigger guard. For the first time since walking into the shop, the ironclad emotional control of the old Delta operator wavered. His hand shook slightly as he lowered the weapon. Davy, Abram breathed out, his voice thick with emotion. This is a masterwork. I can't take this. This belongs in your family. It belongs in the hands of a warrior. Damien corrected him, stepping around the desk. Jackson is going into harm's way. He is carrying your legacy, and he is carrying the legacy of the Rangers. He needs this, and I need to know that a piece of me is out there with him, watching his back. Abram looked from the gun to Damien. He saw the desperate, pleading sincerity in the younger man's eyes. This wasn't just a gift. This was Damien's way of finally laying a piece of his own survivor's guilt to rest. Slowly, Abram nodded. He carefully placed the pistol back into the foam cutout and closed the lid, securing the latches. He picked up the manila envelope full of cash and tucked it quietly back into his jacket pocket. "Thank you, brother," Abram said softly. The use of the word brother caused Damien's chest to swell with an indescribable pride. "Come on," Damien said, clearing his throat and grabbing the handle of the Pelican case. "Let's walk you out. I'll carry the heavy lifting." When they opened the office door and stepped back out onto the showroom floor, the atmosphere had drastically changed. The music had been turned off. In the center aisle, Logan and Chad were on their hands and knees. They each had a bucket of soapy water and a small scrub brush. They were furiously scrubbing the floor, their faces flushed with exertion and humiliation. They didn't dare look up as Damien and Abram walked past. As they reached the front door, Abram paused. He looked back toward the center island, where the vintage Vietnam-era 1911 sat under its spotlight. He stared at it for a long, quiet moment, acknowledging the ghosts of his past, before turning his gaze to the heavy Pelican case in Damien's hand, representing the future of his bloodline. "Tell your boys to go easy on the soap," Abram said softly, a hint of his dry rural humor returning. "They're gonna make the floor too slick. Somebody might break a hip." Damien laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He opened the heavy glass door for the old man. "Safe travels back to Iowa, Major," Damien said, handing the case over. "And tell Jackson. Tell him to keep his head down and his powder dry. Tell him a ranger is pulling for him." "I'll tell him," Abram promised. He took the case, the weight of the steel a comforting anchor in his grip. As Abram Moreau walked out into the bright morning sun, his muddy boots crunching against the pristine concrete of the affluent parking lot, Damien Hawthorne stood in the doorway and watched him go. He watched until the battered old Ford pickup truck pulled out onto the highway and disappeared from sight, carrying with it a legend of the past and the salvation of the future. Gravel crunched beneath heavy combat boots as Jackson Moreau stepped out of the Jeep. He was tall, carrying the lean, dense muscle mass forged by months of relentless physical conditioning. His hair was cropped into a severe high and tight, and his jawline was sharp, lacking the deep, sun-baked crevices that mapped his grandfather's face. Jackson walked with a distinct, upright posture, a physical manifestation of the tan beret he had recently earned. Abram sat on the wraparound porch, a glass of iced tea resting on the wooden railing. He watched his grandson approach, his pale blue eyes taking in the boy's squared shoulders and confident stride. Beneath the pride, a cold knot of dread tightened in Abram's gut. He knew exactly what that confident stride looked like. He had seen it on hundreds of young men in the 70s and 80s. He also knew how quickly that stride could be broken by shrapnel and concussive blasts. "Grandpa," Jackson said, stepping up onto the porch and enveloping the older man in a tight hug. "Look at you," Abram murmured, patting Jackson's solid back before pulling away. "They feed you nothing but raw steak and gunpowder down at Benning?" Jackson chuckled, a bright, youthful sound. "Something like that. We ship out in 72 hours. I wanted to come see you before I headed to base. Get some of Grandma's old recipes. Maybe hear one of your stories." Abram gestured to the empty rocking chair beside him. "Sit down, son." As Jackson settled into the chair, the boy's eyes fell upon the heavy black Pelican case resting on the small wooden table between them. He recognized the brand instantly. It was the kind of hardware case used by armorers and serious professionals. "What's that?" Jackson asked, pointing a calloused finger at the plastic shell. Abram didn't answer immediately. He picked up his iced tea, took a slow sip, and set it back down. The crickets in the tall grass had begun their evening chorus, a peaceful symphony that stood in stark contrast to the conversation Abram was about to initiate. "You think you're ready, Jackson?" Abram asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was dipping below the tree line. "You think you know what happens when the ramp drops and the air smells like copper?" Jackson's smile faded. He shifted in his seat, his posture stiffening defensively. "I passed selection, Grandpa. I'm a ranger. My chalk is the best trained in the battalion. We're ready for whatever happens in Syria." "Training is paper," Abram stated flatly. Combat is fire. Paper burns, son. When the ambush hits, when your comms go dead, when the man next to you takes a round to the neck and you're slipping in his blood trying to drag him behind a burned-out truck, training goes out the window. Instinct takes over. And in those moments, the only things keeping you alive are the man to your left, the man to your right, and the steel in your hands. Jackson swallowed hard. His grandfather rarely spoke of his time in Delta Force. To hear him speak with such raw, unvarnished brutalism was jarring. Abram reached over and unclasped the heavy latches of the Pelican case. They popped open with a sharp, authoritative snap. He lifted the lid, revealing the matte black, custom-milled 2011 pistol resting in the foam. Jackson gasped softly. He knew firearms. He could immediately identify the aggressive grip texturing, the extended magazine well, and the flawless, hand-fitted slide. "Grandpa, is that a custom build? That's gorgeous. Where did you get this?" "I didn't buy it," Abram said. He reached into the case, wrapping his hand around the grip, and lifted it out. He held it out to his grandson. "Grip first. A man I served with built it. A man whose life I had to pull out of the fire in Mogadishu. He spent a year milling this from raw billet steel. He locked it in a vault because he said he didn't know who he was saving it for." Jackson took the weapon. The sheer weight of it, the perfect balance, immediately registered in his muscles. It felt alive. "Look at the serial number," Abram instructed. Jackson tilted the frame, catching the fading sunlight on the engraved steel above the trigger guard. MOG 100393. October 3rd, 1993. Jackson read aloud, his voice dropping to an awestruck whisper. "The Battle of Mogadishu. That weapon carries the ghost of the men who didn't come home that day," Abram said, his voice thick with a profound, terrifying sorrow. "It carries the gratitude of a man who survived, and now, it carries my bloodline. You listen to me, Jackson. Your rifle is your primary. It's your sword. But this is your shield. When the rifle jams, when the magazine runs dry, when the enemy is in your face and the world goes dark, you draw this weapon. You trust it." Jackson looked up from the gun, meeting his grandfather's piercing blue eyes. He finally understood the gravity of the gift. This wasn't a graduation present. It was a lifeline forged in blood and survivor's guilt. "I'll bring it back to you, Grandpa," Jackson promised, his grip tightening around the textured handle. "I swear it." "Don't bring it back to me," Abram replied, leaning back in his rocking chair as the last rays of sunlight vanished from the sky. "Just bring yourself back. The steel doesn't matter. The boy holding it does." "Fine." Alkaline dust choked the air inside the shattered concrete compound, tasting like chalk and dried blood. Northern Syria was a graveyard of broken buildings and fractured loyalties, and Jackson Moreau's Ranger Chalk had just walked right into the middle of a meticulously coordinated nightmare. 3 months into his deployment, the romanticized illusions of combat had been entirely burned away, leaving only exhaustion, hypervigilance, and the deafening roar of war. They had been tasked with a high-value target extraction in a contested urban sector. Intel had promised light resistance. Intel had been dead wrong. "Hayes, get that 240 up on the berm. Lay down suppressive fire on that second-story window." Jackson screamed, his voice raw, barely audible over the rhythmic, terrifying crack thump of incoming AK-47 fire, tearing chunks of concrete off the wall mere inches from his helmet. Specialist Hayes scrambled through the rubble, dragging the heavy machine gun, his face masked in gray dust and sweat. "I'm on it, Moreau. Cover me." Jackson leaned around the crumbling pillar, bringing his M4 carbine up to his shoulder. He acquired a muzzle flash in his holographic sight and squeezed the trigger, sending a 3-round burst into the dark window across the street. A scream echoed back, instantly swallowed by the chaos. "We are black on comms," Corporal Brooks yelled from the rear of the room, frantically twisting the dials on his radio. "Jamming signals are everywhere. We have no air support, Moreau. We are completely cut off." Jackson ducked back behind cover as a rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the exterior wall of their building. The explosion was absolute. The shockwave picked Jackson up and threw him violently against the floor. His vision blurred, his ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine that drowned out the gunfire. He tasted copper. Dust rained down in sheets, plunging the room into a suffocating gray twilight. Jackson coughed, fighting to clear his lungs, and pushed himself up onto his knees. Through the haze, he saw Brooks lying motionless beneath a pile of collapsed cinder blocks. Hayes was slumped over his machine gun, bleeding from a shrapnel wound to the shoulder. They were being overrun. Jackson grabbed his M4, scrambling toward the doorway that led to the central courtyard. He could hear boots crunching on gravel. Guttural shouts in Arabic echoed off the walls. They were pushing into the compound. Jackson rounded the corner, raising his rifle. 2 heavily armed insurgents were charging up the steps. Jackson pulled the trigger. Click. The sickening hollow sound of a dead trigger echoed in his hands. A piece of concrete shrapnel from the RPG blast had lodged directly into the ejection port of his rifle, causing a catastrophic bolt override malfunction. The weapon was a paperweight. The lead insurgent saw Jackson, his eyes widening in triumph. He raised his AK-47, screaming a battle cry. Jackson had less than a second. There was no time to clear the malfunction. There was no time to find cover. Abram's words echoed in his ringing ears. When the world goes dark, you draw this weapon. Jackson dropped the useless M4, letting it hang on its sling. His right hand flashed down to his drop-leg holster. His fingers found the familiar aggressive texture of the black 2011. He defeated the retention hood, drawing the heavy steel pistol in a fluid, lightning-fast arc. As the insurgent's finger tightened on his trigger, Jackson punched the custom handgun forward. The tritium night sights aligned perfectly in his vision, a glowing green dot resting squarely on the enemy's chest. Jackson fired. The custom pistol didn't snap violently like a standard polymer handgun. The heavy steel frame absorbed the recoil, the hand-lapped slide cycling backward with a smooth, mechanical perfection. The crack of the 9mm round was deafening in the enclosed stairwell. The insurgent staggered backward, his rifle firing harmlessly into the ceiling as he collapsed. The second insurgent, shocked by the sudden resistance, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Jackson didn't. The 2011 was already tracking to the next target. The trigger reset was impossibly short, barely a millimeter of travel. Jackson double-tapped. 2 rounds center mass. The second man hit the floor before he could even raise his weapon. Jackson didn't stop moving. He stepped over the bodies, pushing into the courtyard. The adrenaline dumped into his system, turning the world into slow motion. He cleared the left corner, 1 target, 1 shot. The pistol ran flawlessly, cycling round after round, spitting brass casings into the dust. The weight of the weapon kept his sights dead on target, allowing for impossibly fast follow-up shots. He moved like a ghost through the smoke, a terrifying echo of his grandfather from 30 years prior. The weapon never choked on the fine alkaline sand. It never failed to feed. It chewed through the chaos with absolute relentless precision. By the time the quick reaction force finally punched through the jamming signal and arrived with Apache air support 20 minutes later, the compound was secured. Jackson Moreau was sitting on a pile of rubble near the doorway, covered in dust, sweat, and blood. His hands were shaking. In his lap rested the black 2011. Its slide locked back, utterly empty. Corporal Brooks had survived. Hayes was being loaded onto a medevac chopper. Jackson stared down at the pistol. The matte black finish was deeply scratched on the slide where it had scraped against concrete. The grip was caked in dried mud and grit. It looked battered. It looked ruined. Jackson pressed the weapon to his chest, closing his eyes, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. It had kept him alive. Snow flurries whipped against the tinted glass of Hawthorne's Elite Armory, piling up against the curb in the affluent Oak Brook Shopping Center. It was a bleak, freezing Tuesday in late January, 6 months after Abram Moreau had first walked through those doors. Inside the shop, the atmosphere was markedly different. Logan and Chad were still behind the counter, but their demeanors had permanently shifted. The obnoxious swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, attentive professionalism. They no longer mocked the customers. They actually listened. Damien Hawthorne's furious reprimand had left an indelible mark on them. Damien was in the back office, running inventory spreadsheets on his laptop. The heavy oak door was propped open, allowing him to keep an eye on the floor. The front door chimed. Damien looked up from his screen. Walking through the door was a familiar figure wearing a faded, tan Carhartt jacket and heavy work boots. Abram Moreau stepped onto the polished epoxy floor, brushing snow off his shoulders. Damien immediately pushed his chair back, a massive grin breaking across his bearded face. He hurried out of the office, walking briskly down the center aisle. "Major," Damien called out, extending his hand. "Good to see you, sir. What brings you back to the cold?" Abram took the hand, shaking it firmly. "Just passing through, Davy. Needed to pick up some parts for the tractor. Figured I'd stop in." "I'm glad you did," Damien said, his eyes scanning the older man. "You look well." "I'm doing all right," Abram replied softly. He stepped aside, revealing a second figure who had walked in quietly behind him, obscured by the heavy winter door. Damien Froze. It was a young man in an Army Class A dress uniform. He wore the tan beret of the Ranger Regiment perfectly angled on his head. Pinned to his chest was a freshly minted combat infantryman badge, a Purple Heart, and an Army Commendation Medal with a V device for valor. The young man was leaning heavily on a black aluminum cane. His left leg was braced underneath the tailored green trousers. He walked with a pronounced limp, his face pale but his jaw set with an undeniable, hardened resolve. "Davy," Abram said, his voice thick with a pride that transcended words. "I'd like you to meet my grandson, Sergeant Jackson Moreau." Damien's breath hitched. He looked at the young ranger, seeing the same fierce, pale blue eyes that belonged to the grandfather. He saw the physical toll the war had taken on the boy, the way he favored his left side, the subtle tension in his shoulders that only combat veterans ever truly recognized in one another. Without thinking, Damien snapped to attention. He didn't render a salute. Jackson wasn't an officer, but he stood at perfect rigidity, a deep sign of ultimate respect. "Sergeant Moreau," Damien said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome home, son. It is a profound honor to meet you." Jackson let go of his cane with his right hand and reached out, gripping Damien's hand in a vice-like shake. "The honor is mine, Mr. Hawthorne. My grandfather told me what you did for him in Somalia. He told me about the weapon." Jackson reached into his heavy green uniform overcoat. He pulled out a black Pelican case smaller this time, a single pistol case, and set it gently on the glass display counter. Logan and Chad, sensing the weight of the moment, stopped what they were doing and watched from a respectful distance. Jackson popped the latches and opened the lid. Damien stared down at the firearm resting in the foam. It was the Ghost, but it was no longer the flawless, pristine masterpiece he had locked in his vault. The matte black nitride coating was heavily worn along the edges of the slide, exposing the silver steel beneath. Deep, gouged scratches marred the frame where it had been slammed against stone and rubble. Fine, white Syrian dust was permanently embedded in the aggressive checkering of the grips and in the slide serrations. It smelled faintly of burnt carbon and dried oil. It looked exactly the way a combat weapon was supposed to look. "I was ambushed in Raqqa," Jackson said quietly, his eyes fixed on the gun. Comms went down. RPG hit our position. My M4 suffered a bolt override. I was cornered by two hostiles in a stairwell. He paused, swallowing hard, the memory flashing behind his eyes. "I drew the 2011. I put 3 rounds downrange in under a second and a half. It didn't jam. It didn't stovepipe. It ran like a sewing machine." Jackson looked up, meeting Damien's watery eyes. "You built a shield, Mr. Hawthorne," Jackson whispered. "It brought me back to my grandfather. I wanted to come here and show you what your work did. I wanted to say thank you." Damien slowly reached out, running a calloused fingertip over the deep scratches on the slide. He felt the history etched into the steel, the guilt he had carried since 1993, the suffocating debt he felt he owed to Abram Moreau, suddenly felt incredibly light. The circle was closed. "You don't owe me a thank you, Sergeant," Damien choked out, wiping a stray tear from his cheek. "You paid the tab in full. You both did." Abram placed a heavy, weathered hand on his grandson's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. The old farmer looked at the heavily scarred gun on the counter, then at his wounded, surviving grandson, and finally at the man he had saved 3 decades ago. In a world full of chrome and glass, of superficial tactical bravado and unearned arrogance. The truest display of strength wasn't found in untouched weapons or flawless uniforms. It was found in the scars. It was found in the mud on the boots, the scratches on the steel, and the unbreakable bond of men who had walked through the fire and lived to tell the tale. The story of Abram, Damien, and Jackson is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the clothes you wear, the money in your bank account, or the pristine gear you show off. True strength is forged in the fires of adversity, hidden beneath muddy boots, faded jackets, and quiet humility. We live in a world quick to judge a book by its cover, but as the arrogant clerks at Hawthorne's elite armory learned the hard way, you never know the heavy burdens or the legendary past of the person standing right in front of you. Honor the scars, respect the quiet ones, and remember that real heroes rarely announce themselves. If this story of legacy, survival, and ultimate respect resonated with you, please smash that like button. Share this video with someone who respects our veterans, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, drama-filled, real-life stories. Let us know in the comments, what did you think of Damien's ultimate gift? See you in the next one.